My son and his wife forgot I existed for years. I funded their entire luxury lifestyle, paying their mortgage and leasing their cars, but they treated me like a broken ATM. The final straw came when I called them from a hospital bed, and they hung up on me because I was interrupting their wine tasting party. So I stopped trying. I changed my name, sold my house, and disappeared without a single trace. 8 months later, their greed dragged them into a federal courtroom, and I was the one holding the gavel. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe ungrateful children should face the consequences of their actions. My name is Warren. I am 64 years old, and I spent my entire adult life building a heavy machinery supply company from the dirt up. I worked 70-hour weeks coming home with grease under my fingernails and an aching back. Also, my son Justin would never have to know the feeling of a past due notice or an empty refrigerator. I gave him the world. I paid for his expensive university out of pocket. I funded his lavish wedding. I made sure he started his adult life with zero debt. In return, he gave me absolute deafening silence. It was a Tuesday evening when my chest suddenly tightened. A sharp, suffocating pressure radiated down my left arm while I was organizing financial files in my home office. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights, wailing sirens, and the panicked voices of paramedics working to stabilize my breathing. By the time I was resting in a cold, sterile room at Memorial Hospital, the emergency room doctor delivered the diagnosis. I had suffered a mild cardiac event. It was a warning sign. A stark, undeniable reminder that my time on this earth was limited, and I was not invincible. The attending nurse, a kind woman with tired eyes, handed me my discharge papers around 9 at night. She explicitly stated I could not drive myself home under any circumstances. The heavy medication they had administered made it unsafe for me to get behind the wheel. I needed a family member to pick me up and monitor me for the night. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed and stared at my phone for a long time. I had not spoken to Justin in 4 months. Our last interaction was a brief, sterile text message from him asking if his monthly transfer had cleared. Still, I was his father. I was sitting in a hospital gown with a bruised chest, feeling more vulnerable than I ever had in my life. I pressed his contact name and held the phone to my ear. It rang 4 times before the call finally connected. It was not Justin who answered. It was his wife, Megan. Through the receiver, I could hear the loud, obnoxious chatter of guests, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the faint sound of upscale jazz music playing in the background. She answered with a sharp, impatient tone, demanding to know why I was calling so late and interrupting their evening. I swallowed my pride. I told her I was sitting at Memorial Hospital. I explained that I had suffered a cardiac episode, that I was exhausted, and that the hospital required someone to drive me home. I asked if Justin could spare just 30 minutes to come pick up his father. Megan let out a loud, exaggerated sigh that echoed cruelly through the phone. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask what the doctors had said or if I was in pain. Instead, she complained. She whined that they were hosting an exclusive wine tasting party for Justin's business partners and their wealthy friends. She said my phone call was ruining the mood of the party. She told me to just call a cab and stop acting so dramatic. Then, without waiting for my response, the line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The dial tone hummed in the quiet, sterile hospital room. She had actually hung up on me. My own daughter-in-law had left me stranded in an emergency room because my medical crisis was a slight inconvenience to her social calendar. And Justin, my own flesh and blood, had clearly handed her the phone so he would not have to deal with me himself. For years, I had made excuses for their behavior. I told myself they were just young and busy. I convinced myself that Justin was focused on building his career, and Megan was simply stressed by her social obligations. But sitting on that thin mattress, listening to the rhythmic beep of the medical equipment down the hall, the blindfold finally fell from my eyes. They were not busy. They were entirely, utterly heartless. I did not cry. I did not call back to beg for a ride. A strange, icy calm washed over my entire body. It was the clarity of a man who suddenly realizes he has been watering a dead tree for a decade. I opened the banking application on my phone. I navigated to the recurring transfers page. This was the one-sided ledger of my relationship with my son. For 5 years, I had been the silent engine keeping their perfect, arrogant suburban facade afloat. I scrolled through the scheduled payments. There was the automated transfer of $3,500 that paid the mortgage on their luxury condo every single month. Below it was the $800 payment for the premium SUV. Megan drove to her country club luncheons. Then came the endless, unpredictable transfers for their ski trips, their designer clothes, and their upscale dining habits. I was bleeding my life savings to fund the arrogance of two people who could not spare a fraction of their evening to ensure I made it home alive. I looked at the calloused skin on my hands. I remembered the decades of sweat and sacrifice it took to earn every single dollar sitting in those accounts. I clicked on the mortgage payment. A prompt appeared on the screen asking if I wanted to cancel this recurring transfer. I pressed confirm. I moved to the car lease. Cancel. I selected the joint credit card account I paid off for them every month. I locked it permanently. In less than 2 minutes, I systematically dismantled the financial safety net that had shielded them from the real world. The umbilical cord was officially and permanently cut. They wanted to treat me like an absolute stranger. I decided it was time to show them exactly what life was like when a stranger stopped paying their bills. I stood up from the hospital bed and took off the thin medical gown. I dressed in my regular clothes, my movements slow, but driven by a new, undeniable purpose. I walked to the nurse's station and signed my discharge papers with a steady hand. The nurse looked concerned and asked who was coming to get me. I looked her right in the eyes and told her my family was permanently unavailable, but I had made other arrangements. I walked out the sliding glass doors of Memorial Hospital and stepped into the cool, refreshing night air. I hailed a passing taxi. As I rode back to my large, empty suburban house, I watched the streetlights flicker past the window. I did not feel like an old man who had just suffered a heart attack. I felt like a man who had just woken up from a very long, very bad dream. The Warren they knew, the compliant, generous father they took for granted, had died in that hospital bed. I pulled out my phone and began looking up the contact information for my corporate attorney. The ghost protocol had officially begun. The sun crested the horizon the morning after my hospital visit, casting long shadows across my suburban driveway. I did not waste a single second feeling sorry for myself. I brewed a pot of dark coffee and sat at my kitchen table. The dull physical ache in my chest was still lingering, but my mind was sharper and colder than it had been in decades. I realized that grief and betrayal are excellent motivators. I spent the next 48 hours methodically dismantling my entire visible life. I was going to erase myself from the map and leave my son grasping at smoke. At exactly 8 in the morning, I drove to the downtown financial district to meet with Roland Pierce. Roland was my corporate attorney and a man who specialized in brutal efficiency. For 20 years, he had helped me navigate the ruthless world of commercial supply contracts. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he was exactly the kind of man I needed for this operation. I walked into his corner office overlooking the city skyline and declined his offer to sit down. I placed a handwritten list of directives on his mahogany desk. I instructed him to immediately begin the process of dissolving my heavy machinery supply company. Roland stared at the paper in absolute disbelief. He reminded me that I had built the business from a single dusty warehouse into a highly profitable regional empire. The company was generating massive revenue, and liquidating it abruptly would shock the industry. He asked if I was facing a terminal medical diagnosis or a hidden lawsuit. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him I was simply cutting out a cancer that had been slowly draining my life. I instructed him to execute a quiet buyout with a competitor who had been trying to acquire my market share for years. I demanded that all my physical assets be liquidated and consolidated into secure, untraceable offshore accounts. Roland recognized the frozen tone in my voice. He did not ask any more questions. He picked up his pen and began drafting the dissolution papers. The next phase of the operation was my 4-bedroom suburban home. This property was a monument to my past. It was the house where Justin had taken his first steps, the house where I had hosted decades of holiday dinners, and the home I had shared with my late wife. Standing in the foyer, I felt absolutely nothing for it anymore. It was just a shell of wood and brick holding memories that had been tainted by extreme ingratitude. I knew I could not place the property on the public real estate market. A public listing would require open houses, real estate agents, and months of waiting. More importantly, it would leave a massive glaring paper trail for Justin and Megan to track. Instead, I instructed Roland to establish a blind limited liability company. A blind limited liability company is a brilliant corporate instrument designed to completely obscure the identity of its true owner. I would retain exclusive control over the holding company, but my personal name would appear nowhere on the public registry or county tax records. I effectively sold my own home to my own invisible corporation in an all-cash transaction. The legal maneuver bypassed the public real estate market entirely. On paper, a man simply sold his property to a faceless investment group and vanished. The funds were instantly routed into my secure trust. 2 days later, a crew of professional liquidators and estate movers arrived at my property just before the sun came up. I had hired a specialized firm that handled high-net-worth estate clearances with absolute discretion and speed. I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and watched them work with mechanical precision. I instructed the foreman to sell, donate, or discard every piece of furniture, every television, and every painting on the wall. I watched them empty the guest rooms. I watched them clear out the formal dining room where I had hosted Justin and Megan for expensive dinners they complained about attending. The movers carried away the massive oak dining table I had bought 20 years ago. A brief pang of nostalgia hit me, but I ruthlessly pushed it down. Nostalgia is a luxury for people who are not trying to disappear. I needed to travel exceptionally light. By late afternoon, the sprawling house was completely stripped bare. The echoes of my footsteps bounced off the empty walls and uncarpeted floors. I walked into the master bedroom where my luggage was waiting. I had packed exactly 2 medium-sized suitcases. They contained only essential clothing, my daily heart medication, and a few basic toiletries. I left behind my expensive tailored suits, my golf clubs, and the trappings of a successful suburban father. I did not need those costumes anymore. Beside the 2 suitcases sat a heavy locked briefcase made of reinforced steel. Inside that briefcase was the architecture of my new existence. It held my encrypted banking ledgers, the establishment documents for my blind corporation, and the routing numbers for the millions of dollars Roland was currently hiding behind impenetrable corporate veils. That briefcase was my armor and my ammunition against whatever Justin might try to do when the money stopped flowing. It was the only thing of real material value I was taking with me. I grabbed the handles of my suitcases and walked out the front door into the cool evening air. I pulled the heavy door shut and locked the deadbolt for the very last time. I walked down the paved driveway toward the waiting taxi I had scheduled an hour prior. Before I got into the vehicle, I stopped at the municipal trash can sitting on the corner of my street. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my expensive smartphone. This device was the digital leash that tethered me to my ungrateful son. It was the exact device Megan had used to hang up on me while I was sitting alone in a hospital emergency room. I stared at the blank screen for a brief second. I thought about the panic that would eventually set in when Justin realized his automatic mortgage payment had failed to clear. I thought about the rage Megan would feel when her luxury car lease bounced. I powered down the phone completely. I dropped it directly into the public garbage bin, letting it fall among the discarded coffee cups and fast food wrappers. It was exactly where it belonged. I got into the taxi and told the driver to take me to a busy commercial shopping plaza on the other side of the county. I walked into a large electronics retailer and navigated straight to the prepaid mobile section. I selected a cheap basic burner phone and a prepaid service card. I walked to the register and paid for the items using physical cash. I did not use a credit card. I did not provide a loyalty number or an email address for a digital receipt. I left absolutely zero trace of the transaction. I activated the phone sitting on a bench in the parking lot. The only person in the world who possessed this new number was my attorney, Roland Pierce. I had successfully severed every digital, financial, and physical tie to my former existence. The wealthy, compliant father was permanently erased. The ghost protocol was fully engaged, and the silence was my new weapon. I rented a nondescript gray sedan under my corporate account and drove through the night. I crossed 3 state lines, keeping to the major highways until the suburban sprawl faded into towering pine trees and dense fog. I drove for 2 solid days, stopping only for gasoline and black coffee. The silence inside the car was absolute and beautiful. There were no frantic phone calls demanding a credit card number to cover a declined luxury purchase. There were no passive-aggressive text messages complaining about the color of the new vehicle I had just paid for. The further west I drove, the lighter my chest felt. The oppressive weight of ungrateful expectations evaporated mile by mile. I arrived in a quiet coastal town in Oregon on a Thursday morning. The air smelled strongly of wet cedar and salt. The ocean crashed against the rocky shoreline in a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. It was a place where nobody knew my face and nobody cared about my corporate history or my bank account. It was the perfect location to bury Warren Blake. My first objective was the county courthouse. Roland Pierce, my attorney, had already prepared the necessary legal filings and sent them to a trusted local associate. I stood before a county judge and submitted a formal petition for a legal name change. I did not choose an entirely fake identity because that would invite unwanted federal scrutiny and complicate my legitimate financial holdings. I chose a strategic legal adjustment. I changed my name from Warren Blake to Warren Bradley Cross. Adopting my late mother's maiden name was a simple bureaucratic maneuver, but in the digital age it was a masterstroke of evasion. Skip tracers and amateur private investigators rely heavily on automated software that scans property records, credit bureaus, and utility bills matching exact first and last names. By altering my last name and adding a middle initial, I effectively shattered the search algorithm. Justin could scour the internet for Warren Blake for the rest of his natural life, and he would only ever find dead links and closed accounts. The judge reviewed my clean criminal record and stamped the document with a heavy thud. For a minor filing fee, I permanently erased myself from my son's radar. With my new legal identity secured, I walked down the hill to the Marina District. I met with a local real estate agent and asked to view available waterfront properties. She showed me a comfortable modern condominium on the top floor of a secure building. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the boat slips and a private balcony where you could watch the dense fog roll in off the Pacific Ocean. It was not a sprawling suburban mansion. It did not have a heated swimming pool or a grand entryway designed to impress wealthy, shallow neighbors. It was simply quiet, secure, and entirely mine. The real estate agent started handing me glossy financing brochures and mortgage applications. I politely pushed them back across the granite counter. I pulled a certified cashier's check from my locked steel briefcase and bought the property outright. The agent's eyes widened, but she processed the paperwork without asking unnecessary questions. The transaction was clean and immediate. I held the metal keys in my hand and felt a profound sense of true ownership. There would be no unannounced visits from a daughter-in-law demanding money for a luxury kitchen remodel. There would be no holiday dinners where I sat at the end of the table footing the massive catering bill while my son ignored me. I spent the following week furnishing the condo exactly to my personal taste. I did not consult expensive interior designers or buy flashy modern art. I bought a solid oak dining table. I purchased a thick leather armchair for reading by the window. I ordered heavy blackout curtains and a premium supportive mattress. Every single item I brought into my new home was chosen for absolute comfort and durability. I was building a private sanctuary. Once the condo was furnished, I walked down the street to a small local credit union. I opened a new checking and savings account under the name Warren Bradley Cross. I deposited enough funds to cover my daily living expenses for the next 10 years. These accounts were completely isolated from the massive corporate trust Roland managed back east. Even if Justin somehow miraculously found my old bank records, he would never see a single transfer connecting to this small Oregon credit union. The financial fortress was completely sealed. As I settled into my new peaceful life, I finally had time to reflect on the absolute absurdity of the last 5 years. Justin and Megan had essentially treated me like a disposable machine. I remembered a night 3 years ago when Justin called me at 2 in the morning. He had made a reckless investment in a speculative tech startup and lost $50,000. He cried through the phone begging me to cover the margin call so he would not lose his house. I wired the money before the sun came up to save him from financial ruin. He never thanked me. I remembered when Megan threw a massive tantrum because her friends were flying first class to Italy and she only had economy tickets. I upgraded their flights just to keep the peace in the family. I was terrified of losing my only son, so I constantly bought his affection with endless subsidies. But an automated teller machine does not receive love or gratitude. It only receives demands. When the machine breaks down or stops dispensing cash, people do not comfort it. They simply kick the screen, complain about the inconvenience, and walk away to find another one. I had accommodated their greedy and toxic behavior for half a decade by constantly dispensing cash. Now I had simply unbolted the machine from the wall and removed it from their lives entirely. My new routine was remarkably simple and incredibly healing. I started waking up every morning exactly at sunrise. I brewed a cup of dark roast coffee and walked down to the wooden pier. I listened to the seagulls calling in the cold morning air. I watched the commercial fishing boats slowly navigating out of the harbor. I breathed in the freezing ocean mist and felt the decades of tension melting out of my shoulders. My heart rate stabilized perfectly. The chest pains that had sent me to the emergency room completely vanished. I was entirely unbothered by ungrateful demands. There were no screaming phone calls interrupting my evening. There were no manipulative text messages demanding bailouts for terrible decisions. But I was not entirely disconnected from the chaos I had left behind. Every Friday at noon, I opened my encrypted laptop and logged into a secure private server. My private investigator sent me highly detailed weekly reports regarding the immediate fallout of my disappearance. I read the documents while sitting on my quiet balcony. I sipped my black coffee and watched the financial apocalypse descend upon my son and his wife. I learned exactly what happens when two arrogant people who have never worked an honest day in their lives suddenly realize the safety net has been violently ripped away. The reports detailed every declined credit card, every bounced lease check, and every screaming match in their driveway. I watched from 3,000 miles away as their carefully constructed country club facade began to crumble into dust. The Ghost Protocol was an absolute success. I was completely invisible, but I could see every single mistake they were making. 8 entire months drifted by without a single disruption to my newfound peace. The coastal Oregon fog became my steady morning companion, replacing the smog and traffic of my former life. I built a remarkably quiet and methodical routine. Every single day began with a hot mug of black coffee on my private balcony, where I watched the commercial fishing boats cut through the dark, choppy water. The absolute silence was a luxury I had never afforded myself during my decades running a heavy machinery business. To keep my hands busy and my mind sharp, I joined a local woodworking cooperative located just 3 blocks from the marina. I spent my afternoons carving custom dining chairs and restoring antique oak cabinets. Working with wood is a patient and honest process. You cannot force a piece of timber to bend against its natural grain, and you must cleanly cut away the rot to preserve the strength of the whole piece. I applied that exact same philosophy to my life. The scent of sawdust and natural wood stain completely replaced the toxic stress of my former existence. I was surrounded by retired locals who only knew me as Warren, a quiet craftsman who kept his chisels clean and minded his own business. Nobody asked me for loans. Nobody demanded I upgrade their airline tickets to first class. I was just an older man enjoying the steady rhythm of the ocean tide. While my life moved forward with calm precision, my private investigator delivered a digital front-row seat to the absolute destruction of my son's arrogant reality. Every Friday afternoon, I sat at my small kitchen table, opened my laptop, and accessed a highly secure encrypted email server. The reports were incredibly thorough. They detailed every single financial consequence of my disappearance with brutal clarity. Justin and Megan had structured their entire social identity around the expectation of my continuous unacknowledged funding. Without my specific monthly infusion of $4,300, the foundation of their luxury lifestyle collapsed violently and spectacularly. The first major domino to fall was the premium car lease. Megan had grown accustomed to driving a top-tier imported sports utility vehicle. She used it to ferry her wealthy friends to upscale luncheons and exclusive spa appointments, projecting an image of effortless wealth. During the second month of my absence, the auto finance company attempted to draw the payment from the joint account I had permanently closed. The payment bounced. Megan received a humiliating phone call from the dealership while she was sitting in a crowded high-end salon. The investigator noted that she caused a massive scene, screaming at the service representative and accusing them of a banking error before calling Justin in a blind panic. 2 weeks later, a tow truck quietly pulled into their condo parking lot in the middle of the night and repossessed the vehicle. Megan was forced to start using a ride-sharing application to get to her country club events, inventing pathetic lies about her car being in the shop for long-term specialized repairs. Instead of adjusting their spending to reflect their actual income, they doubled down on their delusions. Justin absolutely refused to admit to his social circle that his wealthy father had cut him off. They desperately attempted to maintain their country club facade using unsecured plastic. Over the course of 4 months, they completely maxed out 5 different high-interest credit cards. They charged expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and designer clothes just to project an image of unwavering financial stability. They were burning through borrowed money at an astonishing rate, treating credit limits as if they were actual income. By the 6th month, the minimum payments on those 5 credit cards eclipsed Justin's actual take-home salary. His performance at his corporate sales job began to plummet because his phone was constantly ringing with aggressive calls from debt collectors. The investigator attached a copy of their latest mortgage statement to his 7th monthly report. They had officially defaulted on their luxury condominium. They had missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank had issued a formal notice of intent to foreclose. The walls were rapidly closing in on them, and the financial shield I had provided for years was completely gone. It was fascinating to observe the exact timeline of their desperation. For the first few months, Justin had assumed I was simply throwing a temper tantrum. He thought I was sulking over the hospital incident and would eventually crawl back to him with my checkbook in hand. He had grown so used to my endless forgiveness and silent financial support that he genuinely believed I would never let him face real consequences. He spent half a year waiting for the magical deposit to hit his account, treating my absence as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent severance. When the foreclosure notice arrived wrapped in a certified envelope, the reality of his situation finally pierced his massive ego. He was about to lose his home, his superficial status, and his wife's respect. He needed his disposable cash machine to fix the mess he had made. According to the investigator's communication logs, Justin finally attempted to contact me. He dialed the familiar cell phone number he had purposely ignored for the better part of a decade. He expected it to ring. He expected to hear my voice so he could offer a half-hearted, calculated apology and immediately demand his monthly subsidy. Instead, he heard a cold, automated voice informing him that the number he had dialed was disconnected or no longer in service. He hung up and tried again, assuming he had misdialed. He received the exact same automated message. He texted the number repeatedly demanding I stop playing games and transfer the mortgage payment to save their condo. Every single message bounced back undelivered. The digital bridge between us was completely burned to ashes. Panic is a powerful emotion when you have absolutely no backup plan and no concept of how to actually manage money. The investigator detailed Justin's erratic movements that very afternoon. He left his office in the middle of the workday, leaving a crucial client meeting completely unattended. He climbed into his remaining vehicle and sped toward my old suburban neighborhood. He drove aggressively, breaking several speed limits, fueled by a volatile mixture of deep denial and mounting terror. He convinced himself that I was simply sitting in my living room, ignoring his calls to punish him. He planned to barge through my front door, complain about his immense financial stress, and force me to write a physical check to stop the bank from taking his home. He felt entirely entitled to my money. He viewed my savings as his eventual inheritance and believed he was simply accessing it early. He pulled onto my old familiar street, expecting to see my heavy machinery company truck parked in the wide driveway. He expected to walk up the brick pathway and use his spare key to enter the house I had paid for with 30 years of grueling physical labor. He had no idea that the house did not belong to me anymore. He had no idea that my belongings were gone. My business was legally dissolved, and his father was sitting 3,000 miles away, meticulously carving oak cabinets and watching the tide roll in. He parked his car abruptly along the curb and marched aggressively toward the front door, fully prepared to make his usual selfish demands. Justin slammed his car door and marched up my familiar paved driveway. He carried the absolute certainty of a man who believed the world owed him endless favors. According to the highly detailed timeline my private investigator provided later that evening, Justin expected to barge through the heavy oak front door and find me sitting helplessly in my leather recliner. He intended to deliver a rehearsed, arrogant speech about how my sudden financial abandonment was unfairly ruining his marriage. He marched past the massive oak tree I had planted with my own 2 hands when he was just a toddler. He reached the end of the walkway and stopped dead in his tracks. The front yard did not look the way I had left it 8 months ago. A golden retriever was happily chasing a yellow tennis ball across the freshly cut grass. A young man in muddy denim jeans was kneeling near the porch, carefully planting a row of bright blue hydrangeas into the damp soil. A colorful plastic tricycle sat abandoned near the front steps. Justin stood on the pavement, completely paralyzed by the domestic scene unfolding in front of him. He approached the young man with aggressive confusion. He demanded to know what a total stranger was doing trespassing on his father's property. The young man stood up, wiped the dark soil from his hands, and offered a puzzled smile. He politely informed Justin that he was the one trespassing. Justin raised his voice, insisting the house belonged to Warren Blake and demanding I come outside immediately. The new owner shook his head and explained the cold, hard reality of the situation. He told Justin he had purchased the property exactly 8 months prior. He stated the transaction was handled entirely through a corporate holding company, and the previous owner had completely vacated the premises long before the final closing date. Justin felt the ground drop out from underneath him. The massive suburban house he had secretly viewed as his guaranteed future inheritance was legally irrevocably gone. The sheer panic completely overrode his usual arrogance. He sprinted back to his vehicle and sped toward the industrial district on the edge of the city. He drove recklessly toward the headquarters of my heavy machinery supply company. For 3 decades, that building had been the absolute center of my existence. Justin knew the location perfectly because he used to drop by my office strictly to ask for cash handouts during his college years. He pulled his car into the massive concrete parking lot, expecting to see my familiar fleet of yellow delivery trucks. He expected to find my warehouse manager loading heavy pallets of industrial steel. Instead, he found a fleet of white utility vans parked in a neat uniform row. A massive vinyl banner hung over the main entrance displaying the logo of a commercial plumbing enterprise. Justin rushed through the double glass doors. The receptionist area I had built with my own hands was entirely remodeled. He demanded to speak to me. The confused receptionist called for the floor manager. The manager walked out to the lobby and delivered the second devastating blow of the afternoon. He told Justin the heavy machinery supply business did not exist anymore. He explained that the previous owner had executed a total liquidation, dissolved the corporate entity, and leased the vacant warehouse to their plumbing firm 8 months ago. The safety net was not just temporarily suspended, it was completely vaporized. Every single asset Justin relied upon to bail him out of his continuous failures had been quietly and permanently erased from the map. My private investigator captured the immediate aftermath of this realization from a discreet distance. Justin drove to a desolate retail parking lot on the outskirts of town and frantically called his wife. Megan arrived 20 minutes later in a cheap ride-sharing vehicle. The investigator documented their entire interaction using a long-range directional microphone. The audio file was a fascinating study in pure, unadulterated greed. They did not stand in that parking lot, expressing fear for my physical safety. They did not wonder if I had suffered a fatal medical emergency after my hospital visit. They did not express a single ounce of concern that an elderly man with a documented heart condition had vanished without a trace. They screamed at each other over the missing money. Megan paced furiously between the empty parking spaces, waving her hands in the air. She shrieked that Justin had promised her a life of luxury and a guaranteed multi-million-dollar inheritance. Justin paced frantically, pulling at his hair, yelling that I had selfishly destroyed his reputation by selling the assets he rightfully deserved. They blamed each other for pushing me too far. Then they blamed me for refusing to silently endure their disrespect. The audio captured the exact moment their panic mutated into calculated malice. Any normal family facing the sudden and inexplicable disappearance of an older parent would immediately contact the authorities. A loving son would drive straight to the nearest police precinct to file a missing person report. He would organize search parties, hire local volunteers, and beg the public for information regarding his father's whereabouts. Justin and Megan did absolutely none of those things. Filing an official police report would draw unwanted attention to their own chaotic lives. Law enforcement officers tend to ask uncomfortable questions about recent arguments, financial motives, and the exact timeline of a disappearance. Justin and Megan were terrified the police would uncover the massive trail of maxed-out credit cards and defaulted mortgages they had accumulated. They needed to find my money quietly and quickly before their condo was auctioned off by the bank. Instead of trusting the authorities, they pooled the last of their available cash advances and hired a bottom-tier skip tracer. This was a man who specialized in tracking down runaway debtors and locating hidden assets for aggressive collection agencies. They provided the skip tracer with my old social security number, my previous corporate tax identification numbers, and all the outdated bank routing codes they could find. They were completely uninterested in my physical location. Their primary concern was uncovering a hidden bank account they could somehow drain. Their desperation was driven by one highly specific goal. They were not paying a shady investigator to locate a living, breathing father. They were paying him to find proof of death or establish a trail to my remaining liquid capital. I knew exactly what they were looking for because my private investigator intercepted the email Justin sent to the skip tracer. During a drunken holiday dinner 3 years prior, I had foolishly mentioned the existence of my comprehensive life insurance policy. It was a massive premium policy designed to pay out $1.5 million upon my passing. I had originally established the policy to ensure Justin would never face financial hardship if my heart condition suddenly claimed my life. That single comment had permanently cemented itself in their greedy minds. The audio from the parking lot confirmed their true motive. Megan coldly stated that if I had died alone in a hospital or vanished into a ditch, they needed to secure the official death certificate immediately. Justin agreed, stating the life insurance payout was the only thing capable of clearing their massive debts and saving them from total ruin. They viewed my potential demise as a winning lottery ticket. They simply needed the skip tracer to locate the winning numbers. They had officially crossed the line from ungrateful children into active, opportunistic predators. I sat on my balcony in Oregon, listening to the audio of my son praying for my death, and I felt a profound, icy resolve settle into my bones. I was going to let them hunt for that money, and I was going to make sure the pursuit destroyed them. The bottom-tier skip tracer they hired hit an absolute brick wall. He spent 3 weeks running my old Social Security number through every available database. He checked public utility records, property deeds, and state tax registries. He monitored my old credit profile looking for a single new inquiry. He found absolutely nothing. My legal name adjustment and my cash purchases had effectively rendered me invisible to his automated tracking software. The skip tracer eventually stopped returning Justin's desperate phone calls. He kept their retainer fee and simply walked away, leaving them with 0 answers and significantly less cash. My new identity as Warren Bradley Cross remained perfectly secure behind the impenetrable wall of my quiet Oregon coastal life. Desperation is a highly predictable emotion. When arrogant people are backed into a corner, they do not suddenly develop a moral compass. They simply look for a larger shortcut. My private investigator continued his relentless surveillance and documented their rapid psychological decline. He followed them to a cheap 24-hour diner on the edge of the city limits late one rainy Tuesday night. They could no longer afford the upscale bistros they used to frequent. The investigator sat 3 booths away and activated a directional audio recorder hidden inside his thick canvas jacket. I listened to the clean audio file while sitting in my leather armchair 3,000 miles away. The ambient sounds of clinking silverware and waitress chatter faded into the background as Megan's sharp, toxic voice dominated the recording. She was furious. She slammed her heavy ceramic coffee mug onto the laminate table and demanded that Justin take extreme measures. She explicitly stated that they were out of time and completely out of options. She leaned across the table and suggested they petition the county court to declare me legally dead or officially incapacitated. Justin immediately hesitated. His voice trembled on the recording. He was a coward at his core, and the idea of actively deceiving a federal judge terrified him. He stammered that committing perjury was a severe crime. He argued that if I suddenly reappeared, they would both go to federal prison for massive financial fraud. He wanted to wait, hoping I would eventually resurface and bail them out of their miserable situation. Megan completely dismantled his hesitation with brutal, calculated precision. She did not appeal to his logic. She appealed to his vanity and his terror. She reminded him of the thick yellow eviction notice taped to the front door of their luxury condominium. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of their immediate future. She described them packing their expensive designer clothes into cheap garbage bags and sleeping in a roadside motel. She asked him how he would explain his sudden, absolute homelessness to his wealthy business partners and his arrogant country club friends. She weaponized his massive ego against his own sense of self-preservation. The audio captured Justin breathing heavily. The sheer terror of losing his superficial social status completely overpowered his fear of the legal system. He quietly agreed to her malicious plan. They knew they could not walk into a reputable law firm with their fabricated story. A legitimate attorney would demand solid proof medical records and extensive police reports before even considering a declaration of death petition. Instead, they sought out the shadows. They drove to a crumbling commercial strip mall on the wrong side of the county line. They visited the office of a disgraced paralegal named Silas. Silas had a well-known reputation in the local criminal underworld for fast-tracking shady probate claims and filing questionable estate documents for a heavy cash premium. The investigator photographed them walking through the dirty glass door of the paralegal's office. The place smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. Inside that dark room, they constructed the lie that would ultimately destroy their lives. They needed a compelling narrative to convince a busy county judge to expedite the probate process. They could not simply say their father stopped paying their bills and vanished. They needed a story that elicited deep sympathy and explained the total lack of a physical body. They collaborated with Silas to draft a highly detailed, deeply fraudulent legal affidavit. Listening to the investigator's subsequent report about the contents of this document made my blood run incredibly cold. They claimed that I had been suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia for the past 2 years. They wrote that my mental state had rapidly deteriorated and that I suffered from intense bouts of paranoia and severe confusion. They painted themselves as devoted, loving children who had tried desperately to manage my declining mental health. The story grew even more malicious. They claimed that on the night of my disappearance, I had suffered a massive psychotic break. They wrote that I had wandered out of the house in the middle of the night, deeply disoriented and completely lost. They explicitly suggested that I had wandered into the dense, heavily forested wilderness bordering the northern county limits. They stated that given my documented heart condition and my advanced age, I had likely perished from exposure to the freezing elements. They crafted a tragic, heartbreaking fiction designed entirely to steal my life insurance policy. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were weaponizing my actual heart condition and inventing a fake mental illness to legally murder me on paper. They needed the judge to believe that searching for my body was a complete waste of municipal resources. They needed the court to quickly declare me presumed dead so the insurance company would be forced to release the $1.5 million payout into their greedy hands. Silas, the corrupt paralegal, printed the final draft of the affidavit. He placed it on his cluttered desk and handed Justin a black pen. This was the absolute point of no return. Up until this exact second, their greed had been immoral, but largely confined to bad financial decisions and terrible personal behavior. Putting a pen to this specific document crossed a massive, uncrossable boundary. It was the absolute threshold between being ungrateful children and becoming active criminal felons. Justin picked up the pen. The investigator later noted that Justin's hands were visibly shaking through the office window. He hesitated for a brief second, but Megan placed her hand firmly on his shoulder, pushing him forward. Justin signed his full legal name at the bottom of the page. Megan eagerly took the pen and signed her name right next to his. They legally swore under the severe penalty of perjury that every single word in that document was the absolute truth. They legally swore that I was a confused, dying old man lost in the freezing woods. They handed the signed affidavit back to Silas, along with the last $2,000 they had managed to scrape together from a high-interest cash advance. Silas stamped the document with a fraudulent notary seal, making it an official sworn statement ready for the county court. They walked out of that strip mall office holding hands, believing they had just solved all their problems. They believed they were brilliant. They believed they had successfully outsmarted the legal system and secured their wealthy future. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to ensure they would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The trap was perfectly set, and they had built it entirely by themselves. The legal system moves with agonizing slowness, and Justin was entirely out of time. The fraudulent affidavit declaring me legally dead had been filed with the county court, but the judicial bureaucracy required a minimum of 30 days to process the claim and schedule a preliminary hearing. 30 days was a luxury my son simply did not possess. The massive luxury condominium he shared with Megan was currently in the final stages of active foreclosure. The bank had issued a definitive date for the sheriff to arrive and physically remove their belongings from the premises. That date was less than 2 weeks away. Justin was drowning in a sea of his own making. The prospect of standing on the sidewalk while his wealthy neighbors watched law enforcement carry his designer clothes out. The front door completely broke his fragile psyche. He needed a massive injection of immediate liquid cash to stall the eviction proceedings and satisfy the aggressive private creditors who were calling his phone at all hours of the night. He could not wait for the imaginary life insurance payout. He needed a bridge loan, and he decided to use my name to get it. According to the extensive digital forensic report we compiled later, Justin spent an entire weekend tearing apart his home office. He was desperately searching through old tax documents and forgotten filing cabinets, hoping to find a loose financial thread he could pull. Deep inside a dusty cardboard box, he found a relic from a time when I still believed he was a decent man. It was an old voided blank check. I had given it to him nearly 6 years ago to cover an emergency transmission repair on his vehicle. He had ended up paying the mechanic with a credit card and had stuffed my voided check into a folder and forgotten about it. For Justin, that small rectangle of faded paper was a literal goldmine. It contained my exact banking routing numbers, my personal account information, and most importantly, a perfect, pristine example of my physical signature. He did not simply try to trace it with a pen. He was desperate, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew a manual forgery would likely be flagged by a competent bank teller. Instead, he utilized highly advanced optical scanning software on his computer. He scanned the voided check at a massive resolution. He meticulously isolated my signature from the background of the paper, lifting the digital ink with absolute precision. He cleaned up the edges of the signature file, transforming my name into a perfect digital stamp that could be applied to any electronic document. With his newly forged digital weapon ready, Justin targeted a mid-sized regional bank operating 3 states away. He purposely chose an out-of-state financial institution, believing they would be less likely to have a direct working relationship with me or my local accounts. Sitting in the dark glow of his computer monitor, he filled out a comprehensive application for an unsecured personal loan in the amount of $50,000. He listed my name as the primary applicant and his own name as the secondary beneficiary. The regional bank required a secondary layer of financial security to process an unsecured loan of that magnitude. Justin did not hesitate. He confidently typed in the name and tax identification number of my heavy machinery supply company, listing my corporate entity as the official guarantor for the personal loan. He believed he was executing a flawless white-collar maneuver. He assumed my company was still operating smoothly, completely unaware that the business had been legally dissolved and liquidated 8 months prior. He pasted my stolen digital signature onto the bottom of the electronic contract and clicked submit. Justin thought he had bypassed the system. He had absolutely no idea that he had just stepped directly onto a digital landmine. When I liquidated my visible life and transitioned into my new identity, I did not simply abandon my old financial records. I had instructed Roland Pierce, my corporate attorney, to place aggressive, highly sophisticated monitoring algorithms on every single piece of identifying information connected to Warren Blake. Roland utilized a premium corporate security service that instantly flagged any hard credit inquiry, any background check, or any financial application bearing my old name or social security number. The digital tripwire snapped less than 4 minutes after Justin submitted his fraudulent loan application. I was standing in my woodworking shop in Oregon, carefully sanding the edges of a reclaimed mahogany table, when my encrypted burner phone vibrated in my pocket. I wiped the sawdust from my hands and answered the call. Roland Pierce was on the other end of the line, and his usually stoic voice contained a distinct note of pure astonishment. He informed me that someone operating from my son's residential IP address had just applied for a $50,000 personal loan across state lines. Roland quickly detailed the mechanics of the application, explaining how Justin had used the dissolved machinery business as collateral and applied a digitally cloned signature to the final authorization page. Roland asked me for immediate permission to contact the regional bank's fraud department. He wanted to intercept the application block the transfer of funds and issue a formal cease and desist order to Justin. It was the standard legal procedure to prevent identity theft. I stood in the quiet wood shop, listening to the ocean waves crashing against the pier outside my window. I thought about the sheer arrogance required to steal a father's signature while simultaneously trying to have him declared legally dead. I thought about the absolute lack of remorse Justin had shown for the past 5 years. I told Roland to stop. I explicitly instructed him not to block the transaction. I told him to let the regional bank process the initial approval. Roland paused on the phone. He warned me that allowing the application to proceed was incredibly risky and could temporarily entangle my old accounts in a messy administrative dispute. I calmly explained my reasoning to him. If we blocked the loan application right now, Justin would simply be guilty of a localized attempted forgery. It would be a state-level offense that a slippery defense attorney could potentially reduce to a misdemeanor by claiming it was a desperate misunderstanding between a father and son. That was entirely insufficient. I did not want Justin to receive a slap on the wrist. I wanted him entirely removed from society. By allowing Justin to submit a fraudulently signed financial document to a banking institution located in a completely different state using an electronic internet connection, he was no longer committing a simple local crime. He was triggering automatic federal wire fraud statutes. Furthermore, by listing a dissolved corporate entity as a financial guarantor to secure commercial funds, he was committing aggressive federal bank fraud. These were not minor infractions. These were severe Class A federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences that could not be negotiated away in a county courthouse. I explained this legal reality to Roland. I told him we needed to let the digital ink completely dry on that application. We needed to let the interstate banking system log the fraudulent data. We needed the federal crime to be fully realized and permanently recorded in the institutional servers before we dropped the hammer. Roland remained silent for a long moment before letting out a low, appreciative breath. He finally understood the absolute totality of my strategy. He agreed to monitor the bank's approval process from the shadows, letting the transaction proceed just far enough to cement the federal charges without allowing Justin to actually access the physical cash. I hung up the phone and walked back to my wooden workbench. I picked up my sandpaper and resumed my quiet, methodical work. I felt no anger and no sorrow. I only felt the cold, precise satisfaction of a craftsman watching a perfect joint slide into place. Justin thought he was a brilliant mastermind outsmarting a frail old man. He thought he was saving his luxurious lifestyle with a clever digital trick. In reality, my son had just handed me the rope. I simply stepped back, stood in the shadows, and let him tie his own knot. The wheels of the county court system are notoriously slow, but greed has a peculiar way of finding the accelerator. Justin had successfully submitted his fraudulent loan application across state lines, and while he waited for those funds to clear, he needed to secure his ultimate prize. He needed the court to officially declare me dead. This was the only way he could unlock the massive life insurance policy and claim exclusive rights to my entire estate. My private investigator tracked his movements on a crisp Tuesday morning as my son walked up the wide concrete steps of the county courthouse. Justin was wearing a dark, tailored suit, attempting to project the solemn image of a grieving son who had exhausted all hope. He carried a thick manila folder under his arm. Inside that folder was a complete work of total fiction designed to erase my existence. He approached the clerk at the probate window and slid the documents across the counter. The packet contained the heavily forged legal affidavit he and Megan had purchased from the disgraced paralegal Silas. The narrative they constructed within those pages was incredibly malicious. They legally testified under penalty of perjury that I had been suffering from aggressive, undiagnosed dementia for the past 2 years. They claimed my mind had deteriorated to the point where I no longer recognized my own surroundings. They painted a tragic picture of a confused, vulnerable old man who had wandered out of his suburban home in the middle of a freezing night and vanished into the dense wooded areas bordering the county line. To ensure the clerk did not immediately reject the filing for lacking an official investigation, Silas had provided a completely bogus police report number. The fake sequence of numbers sat right at the top of the application, offering a perfect illusion of legitimate law enforcement involvement. Justin stood at the window, playing his part flawlessly. He kept his head bowed and spoke in quiet, hushed tones. He told the clerk he was my sole surviving heir, and that after 8 agonizing months of searching, he was finally accepting the harsh reality that his father had perished in the wilderness. He formally petitioned the court to issue a declaration of presumed death so he could settle my remaining affairs. The clerk reviewed the heartbreaking narrative and immediately stamped the file for judicial review. When a probate judge receives a petition involving an elderly individual with a documented heart condition and severe cognitive decline who has been missing for over half a year, the court tends to act with compassion and speed. The judge read the fabricated tragedy and decided there was no need to prolong the suffering of a grieving family. He bypassed the usual waiting periods and scheduled an expedited hearing for the very next month. Justin walked out of the county courthouse that afternoon, believing he had just successfully conquered the legal system. He walked down the concrete steps completely unaware that every single move he made had been instantly flagged, recorded, and analyzed by my own legal team. Roland Pierce, my corporate attorney, operated with a level of digital surveillance that rivaled government agencies. Roland had placed an absolute monitoring protocol on my name, my old address, and my social security number across all county and state registries. The very second the probate clerk entered Justin's petition into the public court docket, an automated alert illuminated Roland's computer screen. I was standing on my balcony in Oregon watching a heavy wall of gray fog roll over the marina when my prepaid burner phone vibrated. Roland delivered the news with his usual cold precision. He informed me that my son had officially filed the death petition and secured an expedited hearing date. Roland read the contents of the forged affidavit to me over the phone. Hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing my own son describe me as a pathetic, mentally broken burden wandering into the woods to die, solidified my resolve. Any lingering microscopic shred of paternal guilt I might have harbored vanished into the ocean breeze. Roland asked me for my authorization to proceed with our defensive strategy. I gave him the green light immediately. I instructed him to build a legal brick wall right in front of Justin, but to make sure the wall was completely invisible until the exact moment Justin smashed his car into it. Roland drafted a comprehensive counter-motion on my behalf. He compiled my new Oregon residency documents, my recent banking statements, and a fresh psychological evaluation I had completed just 2 weeks prior, certifying my perfect mental health. He gathered the private investigator's audio files where Justin and Megan explicitly planned the creation of the fake affidavit. Roland took this mountain of undeniable evidence and filed it directly with the probate court. However, he utilized a highly specific legal maneuver. He filed the entire packet as a sealed counter-motion. In the legal world, a sealed motion means the judge presiding over the case has full access to the documents, but the opposing party remains completely blind to their existence until the judge chooses to unseal them in the courtroom. When Justin or his corrupt paralegal checked the public court docket online, they saw absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. They saw their own petition sitting there completely uncontested. They believed the path to my life insurance policy was wide open and completely clear of any obstacles. We had placed a massive legal anvil directly over their heads, and they were happily standing right underneath it, completely oblivious to the shadow it cast. The sheer arrogance of their assumption fueled a level of reckless spending that was almost difficult to comprehend. My private investigator monitored their internet activity and their daily movements, providing me with a fascinating window into their delusions. Sitting in their luxury condominium, which was literally weeks away from being seized by the bank, Justin and Megan began planning how to spend their imaginary $1 million payout. They completely ignored the yellow foreclosure notices taped to their front door. They dismissed the aggressive voicemails left by the private creditors. Instead, they spent their evenings sitting on their couch, browsing high-end international furniture catalogs on their laptop computers. They were incredibly confident that the probate judge would sign the death declaration at the upcoming hearing. With that signed order, they believed they would instantly receive the insurance funds and inherit my entire estate. Operating on this massive delusion, they began filling digital shopping carts with items that cost more than a normal person earns in an entire year. The investigator accessed their unencrypted browsing data and compiled a list of their intended purchases. Megan selected a custom-imported Italian leather sectional sofa that retailed for $25,000. Justin picked out a massive solid marble dining table and matching chairs to replace the furniture they were about to lose in the eviction. They debated the color of velvet window treatments and looked at expensive abstract paintings to decorate the new mansion they planned to buy once my money cleared. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet won using money they did not possess, derived from the death of a man who was very much alive. I sat in my quiet, clean condo thousands of miles away, reading the reports of their shopping spree. I felt a profound sense of calm. I drank my black coffee and prepared myself for the final act. They were busy picking out luxury furniture to fill a dream house. I was busy preparing a courtroom reality that would leave them with nothing but a concrete cell and a metal bed. The morning of the probate hearing arrived with a heavy downpour of rain washing over the city. It was the kind of dreary, miserable weather that perfectly matched the somber performance my son and his wife were preparing to deliver. Thousands of miles away from my quiet life in Oregon, I stood perfectly dry in a small rented anteroom just down the corridor from the county courtroom. I had flown in late the previous night, using my new legal identification. My attorney, Roland Pierce, stood quietly beside me. He held a leather briefcase resting against his side. We were completely hidden from view, but Roland had arranged for us to listen to the proceedings through a secure live audio feed connected to the courtroom recording system. We waited in the shadows, listening as the final pieces of the trap clicked securely into place. Justin and Megan walked through the heavy brass doors of the county courthouse precisely at 8:30 in the morning. My private investigator was already stationed in the crowded hallway, blending in seamlessly with the usual morning traffic of lawyers and distressed defendants. He wore a wireless microphone concealed beneath his jacket lapel. He positioned himself just a few feet away from where my son and daughter-in-law were waiting for the courtroom to open. Through my earpiece, I listened to the raw, unfiltered audio of their private conversation. They had dressed impeccably for the occasion. Justin wore a sharp, tailored black suit paired with a muted charcoal tie. Megan was dressed in a conservative, high-necked black dress. They had intentionally selected outfits designed to project the devastating sorrow of a grieving family. However, their attitudes in that hallway completely betrayed their somber costumes. Through the earpiece, I heard Megan let out a soft, sharp laugh. She whispered to Justin, complaining that her dark dress was too tight, and joking that she could not wait to take it off and go shopping for beachwear once the judge signed the paperwork. Justin chuckled in response. He told her to keep her voice down, but his tone was light and arrogant. He confidently assured her that the hearing would take less than 20 minutes, and they would be drinking expensive champagne by noon. They were practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. They stood outside a court of law joking about my fabricated death with absolutely zero remorse. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. The bailiff called the docket number for the estate of Warren Blake. The audio feed picked up the sound of shuffling feet and the creaking of heavy wooden chairs as Justin and Megan took their seats at the petitioner's table. The presiding judge, a man with 30 years of experience on the bench, called the room to order. The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted immediately. The casual, arrogant banter I had heard in the hallway vanished instantly. Justin cleared his throat and adopted a soft, trembling tone. Megan began taking shallow, uneven breaths, mimicking the physical symptoms of a woman desperately trying to hold back a flood of tears. They transitioned from greedy conspirators to heartbroken victims in the blink of an eye. The judge reviewed the fraudulent affidavit they had submitted the previous month. He noted the severe claims regarding my supposed mental decline and the total absence of a physical body. Because the petition requested an expedited declaration of death, overriding the standard waiting periods, the judge required a formal sworn testimony on the public record. He asked Justin to step forward and take the witness stand. I listened carefully to the sharp, rhythmic sound of my son's expensive leather shoes walking across the polished courtroom floor. The bailiff instructed Justin to raise his right hand and place his left hand on the Holy Bible. The bailiff asked if he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the severe penalties of perjury. Justin did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. His voice rang out clear and steady through the audio feed as he confidently stated that he did. He placed his hand on a sacred text and looked a federal judge right in the eyes, preparing to deliver a calculated mountain of absolute fiction. The judge asked Justin to detail the exact circumstances of my disappearance and his subsequent efforts to locate me. This was the moment Justin committed aggravated perjury on the permanent public record. He took a deep, shaky breath and began weaving a tragic, heartbreaking lie. He told the judge that I had been suffering from terrible, undiagnosed dementia for several years. He described entirely fake scenarios where I supposedly forgot my own name and failed to recognize him or Megan. He claimed I would wander around my suburban home in the middle of the night, talking to walls and exhibiting signs of severe paranoia. He painted himself as a deeply devoted son who had tried desperately to get me medical help only to be pushed away by my declining, aggressive mental state. Then he delivered the centerpiece of his fraudulent narrative. He told the court that on the night I vanished, I had called his cellular phone in a state of absolute terror. He claimed I was speaking incoherently, babbling about being lost in the freezing woods and begging him for help. He squeezed out a few fake tears heavily, pausing his testimony, as if the memory was simply too painful to bear. Through the audio feed, I could hear Megan softly sobbing from the petitioner's table, perfectly executing her supporting role. Justin swore under oath that the phone call suddenly disconnected, and he had spent the last 8 months tirelessly searching every inch of the state for my body. He claimed he hired private search teams, distributed thousands of flyers, and spent his entire savings trying to bring his beloved father home. Every single syllable that fell from his mouth was a malicious, calculated lie. He had never searched for me. He had never printed a single flyer. The only money he spent was paying a corrupt skip tracer to hunt down my bank accounts and a disgraced paralegal to forge the very documents currently sitting on the judge's desk. But the judge, listening to this masterclass in emotional manipulation, bought the performance completely. I could hear the genuine sympathy in the judge's voice as he offered his deepest condolences to my son. He told Justin that dealing with the mental decline of a parent is a terrible burden, and commended him for his supposed dedication. Justin continued his testimony, cementing the federal crime. The judge asked him directly if he believed there was any possible chance I was still alive. Justin firmly stated no. He swore under oath that given my fabricated mental state and my actual heart condition, there was absolutely no way I could have survived in the elements. He formally requested that the court declare me legally deceased so he could finalize my estate and finally find some closure for his grieving family. I stood in the small anteroom staring at the blank wall while the audio feed transmitted the final nail in my son's coffin. I felt absolutely nothing for the man sitting on that witness stand. He was completely dead to me long before he tried to have me declared legally dead to the world. He had just voluntarily supplied the judicial system with all the ammunition required to lock him away for a very long time. By swearing under oath to a fabricated story designed to extract $1 million insurance payout, he elevated his greedy scheme to aggravated felony perjury and massive attempted insurance fraud. The court stenographer recorded every single lie, translating his spoken words into a permanent legal transcript that would soon be used to destroy him. Roland Pierce looked at me and offered a slow, cold nod. The trap was fully loaded. Justin had successfully convinced the court that I was a tragic memory. He stepped down from the witness stand and returned to his seat next to Megan. They sat together in the quiet courtroom, waiting for the judge to strike the gavel and hand them the keys to my entire financial empire. They believed they had won. They believed their black suits and fake tears had fooled the entire world. They had absolutely no idea that the man they had just buried was standing 30 feet away, straightening his necktie and preparing to walk through those heavy wooden doors. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his thick reading glasses. He offered one final solemn nod to the petitioner's table. He expressed his deepest sympathies to my son, stating that losing a parent to the cruel ravages of cognitive decline is a burden no child should have to bear. Justin lowered his head perfectly, playing the role of the shattered survivor. He brought a folded handkerchief to his eyes, dabbing away invisible tears. Megan rested her hand on his shoulder, rubbing his back in a slow, rhythmic motion. They were putting on a masterpiece of theatrical grief. The judge reached for the heavy silver fountain pen resting on his wooden desk. He pulled the declaration of presumed death toward him. He unscrewed the cap of the pen. The courtroom was so entirely silent that I could hear the faint scratch of the nib against the thick legal paper from my position in the shadowy anteroom. He was seconds away from legally executing me. He was seconds away from granting them absolute control over my entire estate and the $1 million life insurance policy. I gave Roland Pierce a single silent nod. It was time. We stepped out of the anteroom and walked directly toward the main entrance of the probate court. I placed my hands on the heavy brass handles of the towering wooden doors. I pushed them open with a slow, deliberate force. The heavy hinges groaned loudly, completely shattering the manufactured, somber silence of the courtroom. The sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings like a sudden clap of thunder. The judge stopped writing immediately. He looked up from his desk, his fountain pen hovering just an inch above the final signature line. The bailiff instinctively moved his hand toward his utility belt, turning to face the unexpected interruption. Justin turned his head slowly, annoyed by the sudden disruption to his perfect victory. He expected to see a lost tourist or a confused lawyer wandering into the wrong judicial chamber. Instead, he saw me. I did not look like the frail, confused, and dying old man he had just described under oath for the past 20 minutes. I was not wearing the faded, comfortable clothes of a retired suburban father. I was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit cut from premium wool. My posture was perfectly straight. My face was clean-shaven, and my eyes were locked entirely on him. Roland Pierce, my corporate attorney, walked in lockstep on my right side, holding his leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. The physical transformation in my son was absolute and instantaneous. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw literally dropped open, forming a silent scream that his paralyzed throat could not produce. He tried to stand up, but his knees completely buckled, dropping him heavily back into his wooden chair. He was staring at a ghost, but this ghost had a steady heartbeat and a very expensive legal team. Megan turned to look at whatever was causing her husband to hyperventilate. Her eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She gasped loudly, grabbing the edge of the heavy defense table. Her knuckles turned completely white as she gripped the wood, trying to anchor herself to a reality that was rapidly dissolving around her. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with slow, measured steps. The rhythmic clicking of my leather shoes against the polished hardwood floor sounded like a metronome counting down the final seconds of their freedom. I did not rush. I wanted them to feel the agonizing weight of every single step. I wanted them to drown in the realization that their entire criminal conspiracy had just collided with an insurmountable brick wall. I walked past the wooden benches, ignoring the shocked whispers of the few spectators sitting in the gallery. I stopped precisely 3 feet behind the petitioner's table, right behind the chairs where my son and his wife were currently suffocating on their own lies. The judge stared down at me from his elevated bench, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He looked from my face to the photograph attached to the fraudulent affidavit on his desk, and back to my face again. He recognized the undeniable resemblance, but he could not reconcile the vibrant, healthy man standing before him with the tragic, fictional narrative he had just been fed. The bailiff stepped forward, holding up his hand, signaling me to halt my approach. I did not speak to Justin. I did not even look at him as I passed his table. I addressed the court directly. I spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried no hesitation and absolutely no cognitive confusion. I informed the presiding judge that I sincerely apologized for the unannounced interruption, but I felt it was necessary to personally correct a massive clerical error currently sitting on his desk. I told him that reports of my tragic demise had been highly exaggerated. The judge lowered his fountain pen and placed it carefully on the desk. He asked me to identify myself for the official court record. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, perfectly organized folder containing the undeniable proof of my existence. I handed the packet directly to the bailiff, who carried it up to the judicial bench. I told the judge that my name was Warren Bradley Cross, formerly known as Warren Blake. I explained that the first document in that stack was my newly issued official driver's license from the state of Oregon, proving my current legal identity and active residency. I told him that I had not been wandering lost and confused in the freezing wilderness. I had been sitting on a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean, drinking black coffee and watching the tide roll in. The judge adjusted his glasses and examined the plastic identification card. He flipped to the second document. I explained that the second item was a comprehensive psychological and cognitive evaluation. I detailed that the examination had been conducted just 14 days prior by a board-certified psychiatric specialist. The medical report explicitly concluded that I possessed absolutely perfect mental acuity, memory retention, and executive functioning. The document completely atomized the malicious lie that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. It proved that the medical narrative Justin had just sworn to under penalty of perjury was a complete total fabrication. The judge rapidly turned to the third document in the pile. I informed the court that the final paper was the certified deed to my waterfront condominium in Oregon, purchased entirely in cash 8 months ago. It established a documented, uninterrupted timeline of my whereabouts and my financial independence since the exact day I walked out of the hospital and out of my ungrateful son's life. It proved that I had not disappeared into the woods, but had legally, intentionally, and competently relocated my entire existence across the country. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the rain lashing against the tall glass windows. The judge slowly lowered the documents. He looked at the undeniable proof of life resting in his hands. He then slowly lifted his gaze and directed a look of pure judicial fury toward the petitioner's table. He realized instantly that his courtroom, his authority, and his compassion had just been maliciously weaponized to facilitate a massive financial theft. I finally turned my head and looked directly down at Justin. He was physically trembling. His breathing was rapid and shallow. The arrogant, confident man who had just spun a tearful lie to steal my life insurance policy was completely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy who suddenly realized the safety net had not just been removed, but replaced with a bed of sharp iron spikes. I offered him a very small, very cold smile. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate some pathetic excuse or beg for a private conversation, but his voice completely failed him. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had entirely locked him inside. The judge sat motionless behind his elevated mahogany desk, staring at the 3 documents resting in front of him. I watched his eyes dart back and forth between my Oregon identification card and the certified psychiatric evaluation. The deep lines on his forehead tightened into a mask of pure judicial fury. He looked up from the papers and fixed his gaze entirely on my son. The sympathetic demeanor of a compassionate public servant completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying wrath of a man who realized his authority had just been insulted. The judge demanded an immediate explanation. His voice echoed like a cracking whip against the stone walls of the courtroom. He asked Justin how a man who was allegedly suffering from terminal dementia and rotting in the freezing wilderness was currently standing in his courtroom wearing a custom suit. Justin gripped the edges of the wooden defense table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He was reverting to a defense mechanism I had seen him use 100 times before. When Justin was a teenager, he once wrecked my company truck and tried to convince the local police it was stolen. He always believed his charm could override basic facts. He stood up on shaking legs and tried to deploy that exact same tactic on a seasoned probate judge. Justin stammered out a pathetic, trembling excuse. He claimed he honestly thought I was dead. He swore he was terrified when I disappeared and that his mind was simply clouded by unbearable grief. He pointed a shaking finger at me and told the judge I must have run away to punish him for a simple family disagreement. He actually tried to paint himself as the victim of a cruel prank orchestrated by a negligent father. Megan nodded vigorously beside him, forcing out a few fresh tears. She used to boast endlessly at country club dinners about her deep understanding of the law because she had an uncle who fought traffic tickets. Now she was relying on the absolute worst legal strategy imaginable, She was doubling down on a proven lie in front of the man who held her freedom in his hands. I did not say a single word. I simply stepped aside and let my corporate attorney handle the execution. Roland Pierce stepped forward, walking past me with the cold, mechanical grace of an apex predator. He addressed the judge with absolute professional courtesy. Roland stated that my son was unfortunately continuing a pattern of malicious perjury directly on the public record. He unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier bound in dark blue cardstock. He walked up to the bench and handed the massive file to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. Roland informed the court that the dossier contained time-stamped, undeniably verified evidence, completely refuting every single word my son had just spoken. He instructed the judge to turn to the first tab in the binder. I watched the color completely drain from the face of Megan as Roland described the contents aloud for the court stenographer to record. He detailed the comprehensive audio transcripts captured by my private investigator. Roland read the exact dates and times Justin and Megan sat in a cheap 24-hour diner, plotting to extract my life insurance policy. He did not summarize their conversation. He read their exact quotes from the transcript in a booming clinical voice. He read the line where Megan suggested they needed to fake an affidavit to get the $1.5 million before their luxury condo was foreclosed upon. He read the line where Justin agreed to hire a disgraced paralegal to forge the document because he was terrified of losing his expensive cars. The judge read along with the transcript, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. Justin collapsed back into his chair. All the manufactured grief evaporated from his face, leaving only the raw, suffocating panic of a trapped animal. Megan buried her face in her hands, letting out a low, terrified moan. They were listening to their own private, greedy conspiracy being broadcast in a court of law. But Roland was far from finished. He instructed the judge to turn to the second tab in the dossier. He explained that my son was not merely guilty of attempting to defraud a probate court. He was actively engaged in a massive interstate financial crime. Roland laid out the precise details of the fraudulent $50,000 personal loan application. He explained that Justin had deliberately targeted a regional bank located 3 states away. He presented the digital tracking data proving the application originated from the residential internet address belonging to Justin. Roland then delivered the absolute crushing blow. He directed the attention of the judge to the final page of the loan application printed in the dossier. He pointed out the digital signature claiming to be mine. Roland presented a certified forensic analysis proving the signature had been optically lifted from a 6-year-old voided check and pasted onto the new electronic document. He noted that Justin had listed my entirely liquidated heavy machinery supply business as the primary corporate guarantor for the unsecured funds. Roland paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the crimes settle over the quiet room. He then reminded the judge of the strict legal definitions regarding these actions. By submitting a forged signature to an out-of-state financial institution using an electronic internet connection, Justin had automatically triggered federal wire fraud statutes. By attempting to leverage a dissolved corporate entity to secure commercial funds, he had committed federal bank fraud. The judge sat in stunned silence, absorbing the undeniable reality resting on his desk. He looked at Justin with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound disbelief. The judge realized he had not just been lied to by a grieving son. He had been actively utilized as an unwitting pawn in a highly orchestrated federal financial conspiracy. His courtroom had been weaponized by 2 greedy, desperate people trying to steal a massive inheritance from a perfectly healthy living man. Justin tried to speak. He opened his mouth and raised his hands in a weak, pleading gesture. He stammered that it was all a terrible misunderstanding and that he was just trying to secure the estate assets for safekeeping. The judge reached for his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down onto the sounding block with explosive force. The sharp crack echoed across the room, instantly silencing the pathetic excuses coming from my son. The judge did not yell, but his voice dropped to a low, terrifying growl. He informed Justin and Megan that in his 30 years on the bench, he had never witnessed such a brazen, malicious, and thoroughly documented attempt to manipulate the judicial system for financial gain. He stated clearly for the record that he was immediately and permanently revoking the petition for a declaration of presumed death. He officially dismissed their entire fraudulent case with extreme prejudice. Megan grabbed the arm of her husband, trying to pull him up from the chair. She whispered frantically that they needed to leave the building right now. She actually thought they could simply walk out the doors and drive away from the catastrophe they had built. She thought they could go back to their foreclosed luxury condo and hide from the consequences of their actions. The judge noticed her movement. He raised his hand and pointed a remarkably steady finger directly at the petitioner's table. He ordered them to remain exactly where they were sitting. He stated that the evidence presented in the dossier far exceeded the jurisdiction of a simple probate dispute. He looked over to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. He called out to the armed bailiffs stationed in the corridor. 2 large county sheriff's deputies immediately stepped inside the courtroom, resting their hands on their utility belts. The judge instructed the deputies to secure the doors and prevent anyone from leaving the defense table. He announced that nobody was going anywhere until he made a personal phone call to the county district attorney. Justin stared at the deputies blocking his only exit. He finally understood that his life of unearned luxury was permanently over, and his new reality was entirely out of his control. I stood in the center of that grand courtroom and did not say a single word. Most men in my position would have yelled. Most men would have demanded an apology or screamed about the betrayal they had endured for years. I did none of those things. I simply clasped my hands in front of me and maintained an absolute chilling composure. Silence is a terrifying weapon when it is wielded correctly. My son Justin was hyperventilating in his chair, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging for some hint of paternal mercy. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to show emotion, to give him an opening to manipulate my feelings. I gave him absolutely nothing. I looked at him as if he were a complete stranger who had just bumped into me on a crowded sidewalk. The emotional void in my eyes terrified him far more than any angry outburst ever could. My attorney, Roland Pierce, stepped forward, once again smoothing the lapels of his custom suit. He informed the judge that while the state-level perjury was certainly severe, there was a much larger jurisdiction currently at play. Roland turned around and gestured toward the very back row of the wooden gallery benches. A man wearing a plain gray suit stood up. He had been sitting there in complete silence since the very beginning of the hearing, blending in perfectly with the few random spectators. He walked down the center aisle with a calm, measured pace and approached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the legal tables. The man reached into his breast pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a bright gold shield. He introduced himself to the court as Special Agent Miller from the Federal Banking Commission, acting in direct coordination with the White Collar Crimes Division. The heavy silence in the room somehow grew even deeper. The federal agent explained that his office had been actively monitoring Justin and his financial activities for the past 72 hours. He addressed the judge directly, stating that submitting a forged signature to secure commercial funds within a local jurisdiction is a standard state crime. However, he clarified that using an internet connection to transmit that forged document across state lines to a regional bank instantly elevates the crime to federal wire fraud. Furthermore, linking a dissolved corporate entity as a guarantor for those funds constitutes federal bank fraud. Agent Miller looked down at Justin. He stated that the federal government takes a very grim view of individuals who weaponize the interstate banking system to facilitate identity theft. Justin sat completely paralyzed. The realization that he was no longer dealing with a simple county dispute washed over him like a bucket of freezing water. He was not going to negotiate a plea deal with a local prosecutor he played golf with. He was facing the unrelenting, crushing machinery of the federal government. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for his actions guaranteed he would not see the outside of a federal penitentiary for a very long time. Fear is the ultimate solvent for toxic loyalty. The moment Justin processed the phrase federal wire fraud, His instinct for pure self-preservation completely overrode his marriage vows. He jumped to his feet, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the polished floor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife, Megan. His voice cracked as he desperately told the judge and the federal agent that the entire scheme was her idea. He yelled that Megan was the one who found the disgraced paralegal and forced him to sign the fraudulent death affidavit. He claimed she emotionally manipulated him into forging the loan document because she was terrified of losing her luxury car and her expensive country club membership. He threw the woman he supposedly loved directly under the speeding bus, hoping her body would slow it down enough for him to escape. Megan did not sit quietly and accept the blame. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. She lunged toward Justin, swinging her hands wildly toward his face. The two county sheriff's deputies immediately stepped forward, placing their large hands on her shoulders and forcing her back into her seat. Megan screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her fake grieving widow persona. Her voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings as she called her husband a pathetic lying coward. She told the entire courtroom that Justin was drowning in secret private debts and that he was the one who used scanning software to steal my signature. She yelled that he had planned the entire operation because he was too lazy to get a real job after getting fired months ago. They stood mere inches apart, screaming confessions and accusations at each other. Every single word they shouted voluntarily provided the prosecutors with more evidence of their premeditated conspiracy. They freely admitted to hiring the corrupt paralegal. They openly confessed to faking the police report number. They completely dismantled their own defense strategy in less than 3 minutes of pure panicked mutual destruction. I stood next to my attorney and watched their marriage dissolve into a toxic puddle of greed and terror. They were doing the job of the federal prosecutor for him, offering up a buffet of sworn confessions on the official court record. They did not care about the optics or the dignity of the courtroom. They only cared about saving their own skin. It was a pathetic display of cowardice that perfectly validated every single decision I had made over the past 8 months. I felt no pity for them. They had built this trap with their own 2 hands. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block with such extreme force that the loud crack silenced them instantly. He stood up from his leather chair, leaning over the high mahogany bench. His face was pale with absolute fury. He ordered Justin and Megan to sit down, shut their mouths, and not say another single word. He warned them that they were currently standing in a court of law, not a gutter, and he would not tolerate another outburst. They both dropped back into their chairs, breathing heavily, completely ruined by their own desperate admissions. The judge did not dismiss the courtroom. He did not order a short recess. He picked up the heavy black telephone sitting on the corner of his desk. He pressed a button connecting him directly to the office of the county district attorney. The room was absolutely silent as we listened to his side of the conversation. He instructed the chief prosecutor to send his best team to probate courtroom number 4 immediately. He detailed the situation, speaking in a cold, clinical tone. He stated that he had 2 individuals sitting in front of him who had just committed blatant aggravated perjury, attempting to defraud the court and secure a fraudulent death declaration. He explicitly requested the immediate drafting of arrest warrants for perjury, attempted grand theft, and criminal conspiracy. The judge hung up the phone and placed it back on the receiver. He looked down at the 2 deputies standing behind the petitioner's table. He ordered them to detain Justin and Megan if they attempted to stand up or move toward the exit. The federal agent from the banking commission remained standing at the wooden gate, blocking any potential escape route. The trap had closed with absolute perfection. Justin and Megan sat in their expensive black suits, staring at the polished wooden table. They finally realized that their desperate attempt to steal my life had permanently destroyed their own. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open for the second time that morning. The sudden noise broke the suffocating tension that had settled over the room. 2 more county sheriffs walked down the center aisle. They moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who completely controlled the situation. They carried official documents printed on thick legal paper. These were the formal arrest warrants rushed over from the office of the district attorney. The judge gave a single sharp nod to the officers indicating they had full permission to proceed. The sheriffs bypassed the gallery and stepped directly through the wooden gate separating the spectators from the legal tables. They approached the petitioner's table where my son and his wife were sitting in absolute, terrified silence. One officer stood behind Megan while the other moved directly behind Justin. The officer behind my son spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried perfectly across the quiet courtroom. He instructed Justin to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Justin hesitated for a fraction of a second, his body trembling violently. The officer did not repeat the command. He simply grabbed Justin by the shoulder of his expensive black suit and forcefully hauled him to his feet. The cold metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the room. It was a sharp final sound that officially ended my son's life of unearned luxury. The second officer pulled Megan out of her chair. She did not fight back physically, but her entire body was shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The officers began to recite their Miranda rights in perfect unison. They informed my son and my daughter-in-law that they had the right to remain silent. They warned them that anything they said could and absolutely would be used against them in a court of law. They advised them of their right to an attorney. Listening to those clinical legal warnings being read to the boy I had raised from infancy should have broken my heart. It should have brought me to my knees in tears. Instead, I felt a profound sense of absolute closure. As the officer tightened the steel chain connecting the cuffs, Justin twisted his body around to face me. The arrogant facade was completely destroyed. His face was stained with sweat and tears. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, trying to deploy the emotional manipulation that had worked for him his entire life. He begged me to stop the officers. He cried out that I needed to tell the judge this was all a massive misunderstanding. His voice cracked as he pleaded with me, claiming that he was my only son and that family is supposed to protect each other. He actually expected me to wave my hand and erase the federal felonies he had committed against me. I did not raise my voice. I did not step toward him. I maintained my position next to my attorney and looked directly into his panicked eyes. I spoke just loud enough for him and the arresting officers to hear me clearly. I told him that a real son checks on his father when he is lying in a hospital emergency room, suffering from a cardiac event. I told him that a real son values his father's life more than a wine-tasting party. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into his terrified mind. Then I delivered the final, absolute truth. I told him that a parasite forges signatures to steal a life insurance policy from a living, breathing man. Justin opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, but the words simply died in his throat. He finally realized that the endless well of paternal forgiveness was permanently, completely dry. The sheriff grabbed him by the bicep and turned him forcefully toward the center aisle. They marched Justin and Megan out of the courtroom. I watched them walk away in their expensive mourning clothes, completely disgraced and humiliated in front of the entire legal staff. The heavy doors closed behind them, sealing them inside the relentless machinery of the criminal justice system. They were escorted out of the building and loaded into the back of two separate waiting police cruisers. The destruction of their arrogant lifestyle did not stop at the courthouse steps. The financial and domestic collapse proceeded with ruthless mechanical speed that very same afternoon. While Justin and Megan were sitting in separate concrete holding cells waiting for their initial processing, the final stage of their eviction was actively underway. The bank holding the mortgage on their luxury condominium had obtained the final foreclosure order earlier that week. At 2 p.m, county deputies arrived at their upscale building to physically enforce the eviction notice. My private investigator monitored the entire process from the street. He reported that the building management deactivated their electronic access fobs immediately. A municipal crew arrived to change the brass locks on their front door, sealing off the property. Because Justin and Megan had spent all their remaining cash attempting to steal my estate, they had absolutely no funds available to hire a moving company or secure a storage unit. The eviction crew systematically removed their remaining cheap possessions from the unit. The designer clothes, the expensive kitchen gadgets, and the golf clubs were bagged up and placed on the public curb. They were completely locked out of the community they had desperately tried to impress. The Federal Banking Commission operated with equal severity. Agent Miller had triggered a total freeze on every single financial account connected to Justin and Megan. The federal government seized control of their remaining checking and savings balances as part of the ongoing wire fraud and money laundering investigation. The small amount of money they had managed to scrape together from cash advances was instantly locked behind a federal administrative wall. The bank that issued the car lease for Justin swooped in to reclaim their property. A commercial tow truck arrived at the courthouse parking lot and quietly repossessed his luxury sedan right from the municipal visitor space. By the time the sun set that evening, the absolute ruin was complete. They possessed absolutely nothing. They had no home to return to upon release. They had no vehicles to drive. They had no access to credit cards or liquid cash to post their substantial bail requirements. Their wealthy country club friends completely abandoned them the second the news of the federal fraud arrests circulated through their social network. Nobody wanted to be associated with individuals facing federal prison time for attempting to fake a relative's death. Justin and Megan spent the night sitting on thin plastic mattresses in a county detention center. They were forced to trade their tailored black suits for standard-issue jail uniforms. They were completely isolated from each other and entirely stripped of the arrogant entitlement that had defined their adult lives. They could not hire an expensive private defense attorney to negotiate a comfortable plea deal because their assets were federally frozen. They were entirely dependent on the overworked public defender system. They were left with nothing but the terrifying reality of their impending criminal trials and the crushing weight of massive legal fees they could never hope to pay. I left the courthouse and walked out into the cool, rainy afternoon. I stepped into a waiting town car with Roland Pierce. We did not celebrate or exchange victorious words. The work was simply finished. I had successfully dismantled the toxic elements of my life with clinical precision. I watched the city streets roll past the tinted windows of the vehicle, feeling an immense, profound sense of lightness. I had completely removed the parasite that had been draining my energy and my finances for half a decade. The slate was completely wiped clean. Justin spent exactly 48 hours sitting on a thin plastic mattress in the county detention center before his fragile ego completely shattered. He was entirely deprived of his luxury comforts and facing decades in federal prison. The crushing reality of his situation finally overrode his natural arrogance. He requested an emergency meeting with the district attorney. He sat in a cold concrete interrogation room, shivering in his standard-issue orange uniform, and offered a desperate, pathetic trade. He detailed exactly how he and Megan had procured the fraudulent death affidavit. He provided the full legal name, the business address, and the specific cash amounts handed over to Silas, the disgraced paralegal operating out of the decaying commercial strip mall. Justin honestly thought he was buying his way out of a federal indictment. He believed cooperating would earn him a comfortable plea deal. He was actually just providing the government with the exact coordinates to a massive criminal syndicate. Armed with Justin's sworn testimony and the flawless audio evidence provided by my legal team, the district attorney moved with devastating mechanical speed. The local police department coordinated directly with federal investigators to execute a massive tactical operation. It happened just before dawn on a miserable, rainy Thursday morning. A quiet convoy of unmarked black vehicles and heavy tactical transport vans completely surrounded the crumbling commercial strip mall on the wrong side of the county line. Law enforcement officers wearing heavy protective gear locked down the entire perimeter, ensuring there were no escape routes. They breached the dirty glass door of the paralegal's office, shattering it into thousands of sharp pieces. Silas was sitting at his cluttered desk, frantically attempting to shred physical documents, when the federal agents swarmed the small room. They secured him in heavy steel handcuffs and immediately seized total control of the premises. The crime scene technicians methodically dismantled the fraudulent operation piece by piece. They boxed up hundreds of physical files stacked in rusted metal cabinets. They bagged the forged notary stamps, the fake medical letterheads, and the fraudulent bank seals. But the absolute treasure trove of criminal evidence was extracted by the digital forensics team. They confiscated 3 heavily encrypted computer towers and a dozen hidden external hard drives stashed inside the ceiling tiles. When the federal technicians broke the encryption algorithms later that week, they uncovered a staggering volume of undeniable guilt. Silas was not simply an opportunistic paralegal helping desperate people forge occasional legal documents. He was the central architect of a highly organized multi-million-dollar probate fraud ring. The digital ledgers revealed that Silas had spent the last 7 years systematically targeting the estates of vulnerable senior citizens across the entire state. He utilized a vast, dark network of corrupt medical practitioners, unethical real estate appraisers, and greedy family members to forcefully seize assets from the elderly. He had facilitated dozens of fraudulent probate claims, artificially fast-tracking the declarations of mental incompetence or premature death. He extracted massive percentages of the stolen inheritances as his operational fee. The authorities found the names of over 50 active victims buried in his digital files. My son had arrogant assumptions about his own intelligence, but his desperate, greedy attempt to steal my life insurance policy had just accidentally handed the federal government the master key to an entire criminal empire. Arrest warrants were issued simultaneously across the state. The corrupt doctors who had willingly signed fake medical affidavits for cash bribes were pulled out of their pristine medical clinics in handcuffs. The unethical real estate agents who had helped quickly liquidate stolen properties were arrested in their expensive downtown offices. The entire network collapsed overnight in a glorious cascade of federal indictments. Justin and Megan were no longer just facing individual charges for attempting to defraud their father. They were now officially documented co-conspirators in a massive federal racketeering case. The sheer scale of the bust guaranteed that neither the local prosecutors nor the federal judges would offer them any kind of lenient plea agreement. They were going to be made an absolute example of to deter future elder abuse. A criminal bust of this unprecedented magnitude could not be kept quiet. The story violently exploded across every local and regional news network. Television helicopters circled the ruined strip mall, broadcasting the tactical raid to millions of viewers. News anchors stood outside the federal courthouse, dramatically recounting the tale of the greedy suburban couple whose attempt to fake a father's death had accidentally exposed a massive syndicate of elder abuse. My old name was plastered across the bottom of the television screen in bold, flashing letters. Journalists scoured the county trying to find the elusive father who had masterminded the perfect trap. They knocked on the door of my old suburban home only to be turned away by the confused young family planting flowers in the front yard. They flooded my old company headquarters demanding interviews from the commercial plumbers who had leased the warehouse. The media outlets desperately wanted to put a face to the incredible story. They wanted a tearful on-camera interview with the betrayed father. They wanted dramatic sound bites, public displays of righteous anger, and emotional television specials. My attorney, Roland Pierce, received over 100 media inquiries in a single afternoon. Television producers offered substantial amounts of money for exclusive broadcasting rights to my story. I instructed Roland to issue a single blanket statement permanently declining all requests for comment. I explicitly forbade him from confirming my new legal name or my geographic location. I possessed absolutely no desire for public validation. I did not want my face on the evening news. I did not need to sit in a television studio beneath bright artificial lights to feel vindicated. I did not need the applause of strangers to validate my decisions. I sat in my comfortable leather armchair in my quiet Oregon condominium. I held a warm mug of black coffee and watched the news coverage on my secure tablet. I watched the reporters dissect the absolute destruction of my son's arrogant life. I watched the corrupt paralegal being escorted into a federal transport vehicle wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. I turned off the tablet and set it down on the solid oak table I had carved with my own 2 hands. The quiet, silent destruction of their immense greed was entirely sufficient. My total disappearance had served its purpose with devastating, absolute perfection. I boarded a commercial flight early the following morning, using a ticket printed with my legal name, Warren Bradley Cross. I walked through the crowded airport terminal surrounded by thousands of rushing travelers and busy families. Nobody looked twice at the older man in the tailored navy suit, carrying a single leather briefcase. I was entirely anonymous. I was completely detached from the explosive federal scandal dominating the regional news cycles back east. The devastating criminal conspiracy my son had orchestrated was now the sole problem of the federal justice system. I took my seat in the quiet cabin of the aircraft and watched the sprawling concrete grid of the city shrink into a meaningless blur beneath the clouds. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for leaving Justin and Megan behind in their cold concrete holding cells. They had built their own cage. I simply refused to sit inside it with them anymore. I landed in Oregon just as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the towering pine trees. I drove my modest gray sedan down the winding coastal highway, watching the choppy gray waters of the Pacific Ocean crash against the jagged shoreline. I pulled into the secure underground garage of my condominium building. I took the elevator to the top floor and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway. I slid my metal key into the lock and pushed the heavy door open. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. It smelled faintly of sea salt and the natural wood polish I used for my carpentry projects. It was a pristine, silent sanctuary completely untouched by the toxic greed of the family I had permanently discarded. I walked straight across the hardwood floor and unlatched the sliding glass doors. I pushed them wide open to let the freezing ocean breeze flood into the living room. The cold air rushed over my face, washing away the stale, sterile smell of the county courthouse. I stood on the balcony for a long time, listening to the rhythmic calls of the seagulls and the deep, low hum of the commercial fishing boats navigating the marina harbor. I breathed in the absolute, perfect silence. I realized that my survival was no longer a frantic daily struggle against financial parasites. My survival was now a permanent, undisputed reality. I stepped back inside and opened my locked steel briefcase. I pulled out my encrypted laptop and placed it on the solid oak dining table I had carved with my own 2 hands. I initiated a secure video conference call with my corporate attorney, Roland Pierce. Roland appeared on the screen, sitting in his high-rise office, looking exceptionally tired but profoundly satisfied. He informed me that the district attorney was already moving forward with massive federal indictments against the entire document fraud syndicate. I politely raised my hand and stopped him mid-sentence. I told Roland I no longer needed any updates regarding the criminal proceedings or the miserable fate of my former family. The trap had been successfully sprung. The predators were permanently caged. I told him it was time to finalize the absolute last piece of my strategic disappearance. It was time to permanently dictate the future of my multi-million-dollar offshore estate. I instructed Roland to draft a completely new, comprehensive legal will. The massive wealth I had accumulated over 30 years of building a heavy machinery supply company needed a permanent ironclad destination. I refused to let those funds sit dormant in a corporate holding account. I wanted my money to actively work for people who actually understood the value of grueling physical labor. I directed Roland to allocate exactly 90% of my entire financial portfolio toward the creation of a permanent educational endowment. I instructed him to partner with a local working-class trade school in my new coastal county. The endowment was to be strictly designed to fund full-ride scholarships for young men and women studying to become heavy diesel mechanics, industrial plumbers, and structural welders. I had built my entire life with thick grease under my fingernails and deep, painful calluses on my palms. I knew exactly how hard it was to start a business from the dirt up with absolutely zero financial safety nets. I wanted to reward the kids who were willing to burn the midnight oil and physically build the infrastructure of this country. I wanted to financially empower an entire generation of honest, relentless workers who represented the exact opposite of the arrogant, lazy, and entitled son I had unfortunately raised. Roland typed furiously on his keyboard, inputting the strict parameters of the endowment. I then moved to the remaining capital. I ordered him to allocate the final 10% of my liquid assets to a local coastal animal rescue facility that specialized in rehabilitating abandoned and abused senior dogs. Animals do not care about the balance of your checking account. They do not forge medical documents or lie under the penalty of perjury to steal your life insurance policy. They simply offer quiet, loyal companionship. Providing a permanent financial shield for discarded animals was the most logical and compassionate use of my remaining wealth. Roland reviewed the percentages and paused. He reminded me of the strict legal realities regarding probate law. He warned me that even from the confines of a federal prison cell, Justin might eventually attempt to contest the new will. Roland explained that greedy relatives often file malicious lawsuits decades later, claiming the deceased parent was suffering from severe mental defects at the exact time the revised will was drafted. Justin had already proven he was perfectly willing to weaponize my fabricated mental health to steal my money. I looked at the computer screen and told Roland to build an impenetrable legal firewall. I instructed him to insert a highly specific explicit clause into the final document. We were not going to simply omit my son from the inheritance and leave room for a clerical debate. We were going to proactively address his existence on the legal record. I dictated the exact phrasing to my attorney. The clause explicitly named Justin and his wife, Megan. It formally stated that they were intentionally, permanently, and completely excluded from receiving a single penny of my estate due to their documented criminal conspiracy against my life and my financial assets. I mandated that they were to be left precisely $0. I attached the certified psychiatric evaluation, proving my perfect cognitive health directly to the final page of the will. The legal door was permanently welded shut. Roland printed the final documents. He signed them electronically, alongside two of his senior partners acting as official legal witnesses. The massive fortune I had built over a lifetime of sacrifice was now entirely locked away, safely distributed to causes that actually deserved it. I thanked Roland for his impeccable service and his ruthless efficiency over the past 8 months. I closed the laptop screen. The sharp plastic snap of the computer shutting echoed in the quiet condominium. My digital surveillance grid was officially offline. The private investigator's contract was formally concluded. I no longer needed to watch my back. I walked into my small, modern kitchen. I took a bag of premium dark roast coffee beans and poured them into the grinder. I focused entirely on the simple, tactile process. I listened to the loud mechanical crunch of the beans. I smelled the rich, bitter aroma filling the room as the hot water filtered through the grounds. I poured the steaming black coffee into a thick, heavy ceramic mug. I walked back into the living room and sat down in my large leather armchair facing the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I rested my hands on the smooth, cool leather of the armrests. I looked out over the marina, watching the massive gray clouds slowly drifting across the horizon. The deep mechanical hum of a returning fishing boat resonated in my chest. For 40 long years, I had carried the suffocating, crushing weight of an ungrateful, parasitic family on my back. I had silently subsidized their endless arrogance. I had quietly tolerated their constant disrespect. I had nearly allowed them to put me in a freezing, shallow grave just so they could buy new luxury furniture. That miserable existence was entirely gone. The slate was wiped perfectly clean. The massive one-sided ledger of my life was permanently closed, and the final balance was fully settled. I took a slow, quiet sip of the hot black coffee. I listened to the ocean tide pulling against the wooden pilings of the pier. I was absolutely alone, and I was finally truly free. The profound lesson embedded in this narrative is that true power and wealth do not need to be loud. They thrive in quiet observation. When greed and toxic entitlement blind individuals to the value of genuine human connection, they inevitably destroy the very foundations supporting them. The children mistook their father's silent generosity for weakness, forgetting that the hand patient enough to build a safety net is equally capable of dismantling it. Ultimately, the story teaches us that setting firm boundaries against manipulation is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary reclamation of one's dignity and peace. If this story of reclaiming your power resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering narratives about standing up to toxic manipulation.